Thank you all for watching and supporting my videos. Your encouragement keeps me inspired to create even more content. My next big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers, and I can't do it without your help. If you enjoy what I create, hit that subscribe button and join me on this journey. Now let's dive into the stories.
James and Lisa had been saving for years to buy their dream home. When they finally found a beautiful old house in a quiet neighborhood just outside of town, it seemed too good to be true. The price was lower than expected, but the previous owner had passed away, and the house had been sitting empty for over a year. Lisa loved the spacious rooms, the wooden floors, and the large backyard. James appreciated the solid structure and the way the house had been well maintained despite its age. It needed a little work, but nothing they couldn't handle. The first few weeks were filled with excitement. Unpacking, decorating, and making the house their own. But then, small things started to feel off. Lisa often worked from home, and she swore she heard footsteps upstairs when she was alone. James brushed it off, saying it was just the house settling. One night, while doing the dishes, Lisa saw something in the reflection of the kitchen window, a figure standing in the hallway behind her. She turned, but no one was there. James, ever the skeptic, dismissed it as her imagination, but then he started noticing things too. The bathroom door would be locked from the inside when neither of them had used it. The lights flickered at odd hours, always in the same two rooms. And then there was the strange smell, a faint scent of cigar smoke in the hallway at night. One evening, Lisa was in bed reading when she heard James call her from downstairs. She put down her book and walked to the staircase. "What is it?" she asked. James stepped out of the kitchen. "What do you mean? I didn't call you." Lisa's stomach turned. "I heard you say my name," she insisted. James frowned, but before he could answer, they both heard it, his voice, clear as day, calling from the basement. They stared at each other. "The house is playing tricks on us," James muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. The following week, Lisa started feeling uneasy at night. She would wake up suddenly, heart pounding, feeling like someone was watching her. One night, she sat up in bed and saw a shadow in the doorway. A man, tall, standing perfectly still. She gasped and reached for James, but when she looked back, the figure was gone. That was when James finally admitted something was wrong. He started digging into the history of the house, searching through old records and newspaper archives. He found an article from 1976. The house had once belonged to a man named Charles Whitman, who had lived there alone for decades. Whitman had a reputation in the neighborhood, strict, quiet, unfriendly. One night, the neighbors heard a single gunshot. When the police arrived, they found Whitman in the basement, dead from an apparent suicide. But here was the part that made James' blood run cold. The article mentioned something strange. Whitman had called the police himself, just before his death. The recording of the call had been preserved. James found it in the public records. A scratchy voice played through the old audio file. Silence. Mark stepped beside her, staring. Something was buried there. Emily didn't want to say it, but she knew Mark was thinking the same thing. The voice. The shadow. The presence in the house. Someone had died here. And they had never left. They slept with the lights on, waiting for morning. Every noise made them jump. At exactly 3:12 a.m., the bedroom door creaked open on its own. Mark bolted upright. Emily gasped. And standing in the doorway was a man. Tall. Shadowed. Motionless. The same figure Emily had seen before. It took one step forward. Mark grabbed Emily's arm. "We're leaving. Now." They ran. Out of the house. Into the car. They didn't take anything with them. They never went back. The house sat empty for months after that. Eventually, a new family moved in. And at night, when the house was quiet, someone stood in the hallway. Waiting. The house remained empty for almost a year after Mark and Emily fled. The real estate agent struggled to find buyers. People were drawn in by the beautiful structure and low price, but every potential homeowner backed out before signing. Some said the house felt off. Others refused to explain why they had changed their minds. Then, a new family moved in. A couple in their early 40s, Michael and Susan Parker, with their teenage daughter, Hannah. They had heard the rumors, strange noises, disappearing objects, flickering lights, but they didn't believe in ghosts. To them, it was just an old house with history. The first few weeks were uneventful. Hannah loved the space, and Susan enjoyed decorating the large rooms. Michael, a skeptic by nature, found comfort in logical explanations for everything. But then, one night, Hannah woke up at exactly 3:12 a.m. She wasn't sure why, only that something had pulled her from sleep. The room was quiet, the house still. But she had the strange sensation that she wasn't alone. Then she saw it. Her bedroom door, slightly open. A shadow stood in the hallway. Not moving. Not breathing. Just watching. She froze, her pulse pounding in her ears. "Dad," she whispered. No answer. The figure took one step forward. Hannah screamed. Michael and Susan burst into the room within seconds, flicking on the light. But there was nothing there. The hallway was empty. The next morning, Susan decided to dig into the house's past. She searched online, looking for anything beyond the usual real estate listings. Eventually, she found the same article Mark had discovered, a man named Charles Whitman, who had lived in the house for decades before calling the police the night of his death. But there was more. An older, lesser-known article from 1948. The house had been built on land that once belonged to a man named Albert Grayson, a reclusive figure who mysteriously vanished in the early 1900s. His body was never found. Neighbors had long whispered that he was murdered, buried somewhere on the property. Susan felt a chill creep up her spine. Had Mark and Emily discovered the truth? Was that why they had left so suddenly? That evening, Susan confronted Michael. "We need to get the basement checked." Michael resisted at first. What were they supposed to do, dig up their floor? But Susan's fear was contagious. That night, Michael set up motion sensor cameras throughout the house. If something was happening, he wanted proof. And at exactly 3:12 a.m., the camera in the hallway picked up something. A figure. Dark. Tall. Watching from the shadows. And this time, it moved. Not like a person. Not like something human. It flickered, distorting the image, as if it wasn't meant to be seen. Then, the camera went black. Michael didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By morning, he had made up his mind. He rented equipment. Hired a contractor. If something was buried in the basement, he was going to find it. The workers broke through the patched section of the concrete floor. The deeper they dug, the stronger the smell of damp earth and something older. And then, a bone. A human bone. And another. And another. By the time the police arrived, the truth was clear: someone had been buried here. A skeleton, long forgotten, left to rot beneath the house. DNA tests later confirmed what Susan had suspected. The remains belonged to Albert Grayson, the man who had vanished over a century ago. Murdered. Hidden beneath the floorboards. And for decades, he had never left. After the remains were taken away, something changed in the house. The strange noises stopped. The flickering lights never returned. No more figures in the hallway. For the first time in years, the house felt empty. Peaceful. Michael, Susan, and Hannah stayed. And in time, the house became just a house again. No more whispers at 3:12 a.m. No more shadows in the dark. But every now and then, when the night was especially quiet, Hannah swore she could still hear something. A sigh. A breath of relief. The house had finally let go. Daniel and Rachel Parker had been house hunting for months when they stumbled upon the listing. A newly renovated Victorian home on the edge of town, spacious, with a large backyard and a wraparound porch. The price was surprisingly low for such a beautiful house, but the real estate agent assured them it was just a slow market. Rachel fell in love immediately. Daniel, a practical man, had his doubts. Something about the house felt too perfect, too staged, but he didn't want to ruin his wife's excitement. Within a month, they moved in. At first, everything was fine. The house was quiet, comfortable. But after a few weeks, Rachel started noticing little things. Like how the air in certain rooms felt colder, even when the windows were shut. Or how the layout of the house sometimes seemed different. Nothing drastic. Just small things. A hallway that felt slightly longer at night. A door that seemed to be positioned differently in the morning than the night before. Daniel laughed it off. Old houses settle. Wood expands and shifts. Rachel tried to believe him. But then she started waking up in the middle of the night with a strange feeling, like something in the house was watching. And then the walls started changing. A house that moves, it started subtly. Rachel could swear that the doorway leading to the guest bedroom was closer to the kitchen than before. The closet in their bedroom, which she distinctly remembered having 2 doors, now only had 1. She brushed it off as stress. Maybe she was just remembering things wrong. But one morning, when she went downstairs, she stopped cold. The door to the basement had moved. It had always been next to the pantry. She was sure of it. But now, it was 3 feet to the left, flush against the wall. She called Daniel, who looked at her with concern. "It's always been there, Rach." "No. It hasn't." But when she tried to prove it, pulling out old photos from the day they moved in, the pictures showed the door exactly where Daniel said it had always been. She stared at the image, her hands cold. What the hell was happening? The locked room. A few days later, Rachel found another door. She had been looking for a place to store some boxes when she noticed something strange, a door at the end of the hallway upstairs. She had never seen it before. Not once. She pressed her hand against the wood. The handle was ice cold. Locked. When Daniel came home that evening, she pulled him upstairs. "This door wasn't here before." Daniel frowned. "What are you talking about?" "That's the attic." Rachel shook her head. "We don't have an attic." Daniel sighed and tried the handle. It didn't budge. He jiggled it harder. Probably painted shut or something. But Rachel couldn't let it go. She stayed awake that night, staring at the ceiling. The locked door was just down the hall, and it felt wrong. Like something was waiting behind it. By morning, she made up her mind. She was going to get inside. The room that shouldn't exist. While Daniel was at work, Rachel grabbed a screwdriver and a hammer. It took effort, but after several minutes of prying and twisting, the lock finally snapped. She hesitated before opening the door. The air inside smelled stale. The room beyond was empty, except it wasn't. Rachel stepped inside and froze. The walls didn't match the rest of the house. They were covered in faded, floral wallpaper, peeling at the edges. The wooden floor was scratched and scuffed, old, unlike the polished hardwood in the rest of the house. And in the middle of the room was a chair. Just a single wooden chair. As if someone had been sitting there. Watching. Rachel's pulse pounded. She backed out of the room and slammed the door shut. She didn't know what was wrong with the house. But she knew one thing. That room had been waiting to be opened. "The house knows." That night, Rachel begged Daniel to leave. "Something is wrong with this house. We need to go." Daniel shook his head. "Rachel, listen to yourself. We just bought this place. We're not leaving over a locked door." Rachel wanted to argue. But she didn't. She just nodded. She waited until he fell asleep before grabbing her phone and searching through old real estate records, trying to find anything about their home. After an hour, she found something. The house had been renovated several times. Owners had come and gone. But there was a gap, one period where no records existed. The house had stood vacant for nearly 15 years. No one had lived here. No one had sold it. It had just been here, waiting. The final change. Rachel barely slept that night. Every noise made her flinch. She dreamed of that empty chair, of walls shifting around her in the dark. By morning, she made a decision. They were leaving. She got out of bed, heart pounding, and walked downstairs to start packing. And then she stopped. The house had changed again. The kitchen wasn't where it was supposed to be. The hallway leading to the front door was longer, too long. The windows were smaller. The walls felt tighter, like the house was pressing in on itself. And the basement door was gone. Not moved. Gone. Like it had never existed. Rachel turned in a slow circle, her breath coming in short gasps. The house was shifting. Changing. It wasn't broken. It was alive. And it didn't want them to leave. The last exit. Rachel ran upstairs to wake Daniel, but when she got to the bedroom, she stopped. The door was gone. Her heart pounded as she reached out, pressing her palms against the wall where the door should have been. Solid. No seams. No handle. She turned. The hallway was shorter now. The walls felt closer. And at the end of the hall, the locked door was open. The room she had pried open. The one that had been sealed shut. She felt it before she saw it. A presence. Waiting inside. She took a step back, then another, until her back hit the wall. The air was heavy. Suffocating. Then, she heard something. A voice. Soft. Gentle. Stay. And the house began to shift again. Rachel's breath came in sharp gasps. The walls felt closer, like they were pressing in around her. The open doorway at the end of the hall gaped like a mouth. The voice, soft, patient, still echoed in her head. Stay. She turned and slammed her fists against the place where their bedroom door had been. Daniel, she screamed. Daniel, wake up. No response. The walls creaked. The floor groaned beneath her feet. The house was shifting again. Rachel backed away, her legs trembling. She needed to get out. Find another way. Then, something moved inside the open room. A shadow, just barely visible in the dim light. A shape, thin, unnatural, lurking in the farthest corner. She didn't wait to see more. Rachel turned and ran. The hallway stretched as she sprinted. The staircase, she knew it should be just ahead, but now it was farther, like the house was pulling it away. Her chest tightened. The house didn't just want her to stay. It wanted her to be lost. She forced herself forward, counting her steps. 1, 2, 3, the floor lurched. Rachel tumbled forward, crashing against the wall. But the impact was softer than it should have been. She looked up, and realized the wall was no longer solid. It was breathing. Meanwhile, Daniel woke to silence. For a moment, he thought it was still early. The air was unnaturally still. He reached for Rachel, but his hand met cold sheets. Then, he noticed the door. Gone. His stomach turned. He sat up, rubbing his eyes. Maybe he was dreaming. Maybe. Then, the whisper came. Not from inside the room. From inside the walls. She opened the door. Daniel's blood ran cold. Rachel didn't know how long she had been running. Every corridor looked the same now. The walls were no longer straight, they curved inward, shifting like muscle. The air was thick, heavy, pressing against her skin. Then, suddenly, a door. Not the locked attic door. Not the one that had vanished. A new door. Rachel hesitated, every instinct screaming at her not to touch it. But what choice did she have? She grabbed the handle. It turned easily. And when she stepped through, she wasn't in the house anymore. Not really. The walls were faded, the furniture old and covered in dust. It was the same room, the one she had broken into, but now it was as it had been. And she wasn't alone. A woman sat in the chair. Thin. Still. Hands folded in her lap. At first, Rachel thought she was dead. But then, the woman's head turned slightly, her face hidden in shadow. You weren't supposed to open the door. Rachel's throat tightened. Who are you? The woman didn't answer. Instead, she raised one hand, pointing at the wall. Rachel turned slowly. At first, she didn't understand. It was just a wall. Peeling wallpaper, cracked wood, then she saw the shape beneath it. The outline of a door. A door that had been sealed shut. And suddenly, Rachel knew. This was her house once. And the house had taken her, just like it was trying to take Rachel. Daniel didn't care about logic anymore. He grabbed the bedside lamp and slammed it against the wall where the door had been. Again. And again. Rachel, he shouted. The walls groaned. The ceiling shifted. Then, a crack. A thin, jagged line formed in the wall, splintering outward like something beneath it was breaking free. Then he heard it, Rachel. Muffled. Faint. Trapped inside the walls. Inside the hidden room, Rachel felt the walls closing in. The woman hadn't moved, but the air around her rippled, as if the house was breathing harder now. Rachel turned back to the sealed door. She didn't know what was behind it. But she knew it was her only way out. She grabbed the edges of the wallpaper, ripping it away. The wood beneath was old, rotted. Her fingers dug in, pulling, clawing, and then, light. A crack of daylight burst through as the wood gave way, and suddenly, the world rushed back. Rachel tumbled forward, landing hard on the cold, wooden floor of the hallway. The air was clear. The walls were solid again. And Daniel was standing over her, his face pale, breathing hard. The house was silent. The attic door was gone. The woman was gone. And the house was just a house again. Daniel and Rachel left the next day. They didn't take their furniture. They didn't try to sell the house. They just left. And as they drove away, Rachel looked back one last time. The window stared back. Watching. Waiting. For the next person to open the door. For months after leaving, Rachel still dreamed about the house. Not just vague, fading nightmares, clear, vivid dreams. The way the walls had shifted. The way the doors had disappeared. The way the house had whispered. But the worst part was the feeling. The feeling that the house wasn't done with her. That it was waiting. And one night, she found proof. The letter had arrived with no return address. A plain white envelope, tucked into their new mailbox. Rachel hesitated before opening it. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the single sheet of paper. We know you left. But the house still remembers you. Come back. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She ran inside, locking the door behind her. Daniel found her minutes later, gripping the letter with white knuckles. She handed it to him without a word. His face darkened. This is someone's sick joke. But Rachel wasn't so sure. Because when she flipped the paper over, she saw something that made her stomach drop. A photo. A picture of her and Daniel, taken inside the house. But not from the past. In the image, they stood in the empty hallway, facing the camera. And behind them, the attic door was open again. And something was standing inside. Rachel's breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. This wasn't possible. They had left that house. They had escaped. And yet, here it was. A photo of them inside. A door that had been sealed. And someone, watching from the darkness. Daniel's jaw tightened. We're not going back. Rachel nodded, but deep inside, she knew the house wouldn't let them go that easily. And she was right. That night, the whispers returned. The house finds a way. At first, Rachel thought she was dreaming. She was back inside the house, standing at the base of the stairs. The walls breathed around her, shifting like they had that night. The attic door was at the top, wide open. And then she heard it. A creak on the steps. Something was coming down. She tried to turn, to run, but the house held her in place. Then a voice, not a whisper this time. Come back. Rachel jolted awake. She was in their new bedroom. But something was wrong. The air smelled different. Old. Dusty. Like the house. Her skin prickled with cold dread. Slowly, she turned to Daniel. He was awake, sitting up, staring at the wall. His face was pale. His hands gripped the sheets. Rachel followed his gaze, and her blood went cold. The attic door was there. In their new home. The last choice. They ran. They packed whatever they could, left everything else behind, and drove. They didn't stop until they crossed state lines. Until they found a cheap motel far, far away from that house. 4 days, they barely spoke. Barely slept. But the nightmares followed. And so did the door. Every night, wherever they stayed, it was there. Not always in the same place. Once in a closet. Once at the end of a hallway. Once, right beside their bed. Always closed. Always waiting. They knew, deep down, what it meant. They hadn't escaped. They had only delayed the inevitable. One final time one night, Rachel made a decision. She woke Daniel and met his tired, terrified gaze. We have to go back. He wanted to argue. But they both knew the house wouldn't stop. It would follow them forever. Unless they ended it. Back to where it began. The house was exactly as they left it. The walls, the windows, silent, expectant. But something felt different. Like it knew they had come back. Rachel and Daniel stepped inside. The air was stale. The floor creaked beneath their weight. The attic door stood at the end of the hall. Wide open. This time, neither of them hesitated. They climbed the stairs, heart pounding, breath shallow. And inside the attic, they finally saw it. Not a ghost. Not a monster. Just a room full of doors. Thousands of them. Old, new, some rotting, some freshly painted. Rachel reached out, her fingers brushing the nearest one, and a rush of memories hit her. Not hers. Memories of others. People who had lived here before. People who had never left. Trapped in these doors. Trapped in the house. Waiting for someone to take their place. The house takes its due. Rachel turned to Daniel, panic rising in her chest. We need to go, now. But Daniel was frozen, staring at something. Rachel followed his gaze. One door was slightly open. Inside, she saw herself. Standing there. Looking right at her. Smiling. She grabbed Daniel's arm, pulling him back, but it was too late. The attic door slammed shut behind them. And the house whispered one last time. Welcome home. They were never seen again. Weeks passed. The house sat empty once more. And then, one day, a for sale sign appeared. A young couple arrived to look at it. They walked through the quiet halls, admiring the space. Feels like home, the wife said. Her husband nodded. Neither of them noticed the faint whisper in the air. Or the new door at the end of the hall. Waiting.